From NDTV Studios on the second floor of the Duncan Student Center. A Notre Dame student media and Notre Dame television production. This is ND Sunrise. Well, good morning, Notre Dame. I'm Sam Kaufman, bringing you a special edition of ND Sunrise for the week. Today, we have an in-depth interview with Vice President for Student Affairs, Father Gerry Olinger. Father Gerry, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks, Sam.
Well,
great to be with you.
We know you're busy. It's a busy week here at Notre Dame. It is midterms week. You probably don't have midterms, but we know you're still pretty busy.
That's right.
Well, so let's get into it. You have been around Notre Dame for a long time. You've been a student here. You were an RA. You were an AR. You've got your law degree, your MDiv, and you still work here today. And so, with all that you've been around Notre Dame, what still is surprising you about Notre Dame?
It's an excellent question. I would say probably the ways in which it's so, in some ways, the same, right? So I had a first phase at Notre Dame where I was an undergraduate, actually studied law school, and then I was in the seminary, so formation as a Holy Cross priest. Then I went away for 9 years. And so in some ways, some of the similarities, right, with the quality of people, the level of engagement, the care, the sort of importance on community, so definitely kind of some of those similarities.
Yeah.
But it's also, just the realities of a very different kind of reality today than when I was a student. I think about things like social media. I didn't have a cell phone all the way through college. The first time I had a cell phone was, I think, my first year of law school. And just how that changes, right? The ways in which people communicate, interact, the kind of phenomenon as you walk across the hall or across the quad, a lot more people with earbuds and kind of cell phones out. And so I'd say those are probably some of the most striking differences.
Yeah.
Some for the good, maybe some not so for the good.
Yeah. So you've been, you've talked on these differences between maybe when you were a student versus when we're students today.
Yeah.
And recently student affairs has been and in fact you wrote in your email to the student body on the first day of school that you wanted to listen. You wanted to reach out to different people, to reach out to different groups. Tell us about these initiatives and tell us why you decided that now is the time when student affairs needs to have this really intentional focus to listen and talk and have conversation with students.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in some ways, it's twofold, right? Part of it has been, as I begin as Vice President for Student Affairs, I think it's really an important way for me to listen deeply and broadly to our students. I think it'd be unfair for me to come in, even though I have a background in student affairs and have been a close collaborator with student affairs in previous roles.
Sure.
It'd be unfair to come in and just kind of, here are my 26-point plan, fully baked, that I'm going to bring. So I think listening is really important. So I've committed to spending this first year as Vice President for Student Affairs, listening deeply and broadly. I've had about 200 meetings so far.
Wow.
So every director in the Division of Student Affairs, every rector, each of the departments within Student Affairs. In the fall, I really focused on student leaders, so elected undergraduate, graduate student leaders, different heads of organizations and clubs, things like the Diversity Council, Campus Life Council. And then as we move into the spring semester, my commitment has been really to think about more informal ways of engaging. So two primary ways that I'm going to be doing that are through fireside chats, which are here in Duncan Hall. They're all posted on social media and on the Student Affairs website. So just an opportunity for about 90-minute blocks that I'm available downstairs on the side of the fireplace. And it's just really open for either individual students or groups of students to come in, talk a little bit about what you're thinking about, what you're concerned about, what you think would be important for me to know.
Yeah.
And then I have open office hours beginning this Thursday from 9 to 10 in the Student Affairs Suite in the main building, 316.
Yeah.
So I think as I begin, I think it's really important to begin with a posture of listening. But I also think, we've walked through 2 years now of the pandemic. And I think being able to understand how that's impacted our students, right? Whether it be their ability to connect with one another, their sense of belonging here on campus, how it's impacted their mental health. I think it's a really important time for me to be listening. And it's not just the pandemic itself, right? It's a twin crisis of the pandemic, plus some of the realities of continued ongoing realities of racial injustice. So I just feel like this is a great time to be listening to our students.
So you've been listening, and you've been holding different office hours, you've been holding different things, but how are you these fireside chats? I know there was one a couple weeks ago. There's one on Thursday when this will air. They're at lunchtime, or they're at they're at different times. So how are you reaching students that maybe necessarily wouldn't want to come to a fireside chat, or how are you reaching students that, to put it bluntly, maybe wouldn't want to come to you? How are you reaching their points of view?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think one of the advantages I have as a Holy Cross priest is that I live on campus, right? So I work out here in the mornings. I go to the dining hall on a regular basis. I live in Alumni Hall. I'm sorry about that, Sam.
I know, I'm a Dylan man. We're kind of natural adversaries, but we're moving past it.
So things like going out and celebrating masses in different residence halls on weekdays and on Sundays, right? Just the opportunity to kind of be around campus because I live here. I hope that makes me approachable, that students who maybe even don't want to do the more formal engagement opportunities, that they feel comfortable just stopping me and having those types of conversations. So all I can do is to be available, and I try to do that as best as I can. But it's also about inviting students to take advantage of that.
Well, tell us, you've been listening. You've said you've held over 200 meetings, and your department is huge. Your department is something like 20 plus different departments. You oversee 250 staff. Basically, outside of the classroom and the dining halls, you oversee what students interact with. You oversee Res Life. You oversee Rec Sports, UHS, UCC, student media.
Yep.
So, with that wide of a platform that you have, what have you been hearing? That's a lot of ground to cover. So give us the scoop. What have you been hearing from students?
So I often think about three contexts of the work that we're doing in student affairs. So the way at least I start to organize some of my own kind of thoughts and trying to collect that feedback. So the first is we've been talking about, right, the impact of the pandemic. So we're hearing very clearly that it's impacted students' abilities to connect with each other, right? The realities, especially for students who are returning this year, right, who kind of went through a year where there were limited in-person kind of clubs and activities, that they couldn't visit each other in the residence halls, right? The ways that even masking might have inhibited some of those connections, right? How do we create better sense of kind of community? How do we provide opportunities for our students to connect? How do we help them to feel a sense of belonging here, right? Especially if you haven't had the same rites of passage that other students have walked through. I think about the impact of mental health concerns with our students. It's certainly something that predated the pandemic, but I think has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so it's kind of doing two things at once. One is continuing to increase access, especially to the UCC, to our University Counseling Center. So thinking about things like Timely Care, which is a virtual platform that our students can seek both physical and mental health as well as wellness coaching, increasing drop-in hours for the UCC, increasing the staff and availability, things like groups, to provide opportunities for our students who are in need. And then thinking about how we might be able to identify students who have kind of concerns and who are in need of some of our services at an earlier stage, and helping to connect them to those services. So
yeah, that sounds very interesting, and as student affairs has been, as the campus community as a whole has been through a lot.
Yep.
And the world is changing. Is your view of student affairs, do you think it's set in a sense, or is it morphing and changing to address these new needs that students are facing every day?
No, it's a good question. I mean, I think there are some things that are enduring. Student mental health is a great example. So I was vice president for student affairs at the University of Portland from 2012 until 2016. And that was certainly an issue that we were thinking deeply about at that point, and that continues. But I also think there are emergent needs that we're seeing among our students, certainly that I'm hearing in conversations with our students in these formal and informal ways of engaging. And so I think it's both, Sam, right? It's continuing to address some of those enduring issues, as well as being attentive to and open to some of those emerging issues and how we might have to respond in new and different ways.
Well, as emerging issues, as you said, are rising, you've taken the time and you're continually taking the time to listen and engage with students and hold conversations. So I want to know, how, with your tenure, how focused do you plan to be focused on policy making? What are your focuses in your tenure? Or do you even have a picture of that yet?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think it's keeping the students at the forefront, right? And then what is in the best interest of our students, right? How do we best serve our students? And then thinking about whether it be policies, programming, staffing, how do we align kind of, to those needs of our students? So I think that's probably the most important thing for me. And being strategic. There's a lot of things that we can do. We're a big division, we're generously resourced, but we can't do everything. And so I think for us as a team, in conversation with students, how do we identify kind of what are our highest priorities and make sure we're aligning our resources, monetary, programming, people, towards those kind of most important priorities.
Yeah. Well, let's switch gears from here for a second. We've talked about your listening, we've talked about your tenure, we've talked about you as a vice president. But let's talk about you. You are
my least favorite topic, Sam.
No, oh, come on. Let's talk about you for a second. Students want to know you. Students, you want to be approachable.
Yeah.
And so you're a priest in residence, but yet you also have board and trustee meetings, and you have, you just have I feel like you have you're almost to the extremes of like the student versus the board versus everything else. Are you finding it hard to balance it all, or are you finding it easy?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've been in senior administration at different universities here and at the University of Portland for 12 years. So in some ways, I think you kind of learn how to better balance your time. And I think it's about being present. Like, certainly I have things like Board of Trustees meetings and university representation that does require me to travel and to be kind of away at events and meetings. But when I'm here, to really focus on being present, being available for our students. A couple ways I do that. I make cookies most Sunday nights in Alumni Hall. So it's 7:15 p.m. before our Alumni Hall Mass. And it's a great opportunity for me just to kind of check in with guys, right? To see how folks are doing, to get a sense of what's going on in their lives. Sometimes you'll learn something like one of their grandparents is not doing well. Mm-hmm. And it just gives me an opportunity to kind of make a note of that at the cookie night and then to follow up at a later time. So trying to be attentive to things like that. I've been trying to really proactively get around to all of the residence halls. I just got invited to celebrate Milkshake Mass on St. Patrick's Day, so March 17th in Dillon. I hope I see you there, Sam.
It'll be a fun one, I'm sure.
But finding ways to get into all the various halls, men's and women's on campus, which is just a great chance for me to be able to connect with students. So I think it's finding kind of those right opportunities and finding that right balance. It's not always easy. I mean, you know that as a student, but I think I'm probably getting better at finding a good balance.
Well,
not perfect at it.
Well, I don't think any of us are perfect at balancing our time. Certainly we can all be, it all changes and it all, I don't know, it is certainly a balance. You have, in your tenure, you've kind of almost had to focus on the pandemic. We have, as we came back to campus this year, we decided we were coming back. We decided we were vaccinating students. We decided we were not masking right at the beginning of the first semester. We obviously had masks for a few weeks at the beginning of the second semester. I'm wondering for you, and we're seeing a changing world as well. We're seeing a changing world in the pandemic with rules and vaccines and masks, and it's all, and it changes every day almost.
Yeah.
For you, do you see an end goal with the pandemic here at Notre Dame? Are you seeing the light at the end of the tunnel yet? or are you still cautious about it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly hopeful for where we're at, especially compared to where we started the semester. And I think we're seeing that nationwide, right? I'm a daily reader of the New York Times, so it's been good to see those numbers continue to decrease.
Absolutely.
Typically like 62%, 65% every day. So I think that's a really positive sign of hope. Certainly the change in CDC guidance around masking and even the ways we kind of think about masking, kind of moving away from just total number of cases into severity of cases, hospitalizations, I think is a really important and positive step forward. I want to be clear though, right? We have to continue to be attentive. I know that some health experts are talking about kind of a seasonal reality that might see some upticks. So I don't think we're necessarily done with the pandemic, but I do think we're seeing some changing realities that are very hopeful, and I'm really excited about that. I think as a university, we're committed to keeping kind of our current protocols in place, maybe with a couple of shifts, but really kind of keeping on the whole the protocols in place for the remainder of the semester. And so I think that should hopefully bring some comfort to the community. And then we'll continue to look at, the best kind of advice from a kind of health perspective and determine what we'll do in the summer and kind of moving forward.
Well, as we talk today, Notre Dame has a long history and it has a long tradition. And the senior class of the current senior class is the only class that has not had a year affected by COVID. They had their freshman year, and then we were sent home. Well, I wasn't here yet, but students were sent home early. Then last year we were doing it in the midst of the pandemic, and this year we've it's been a roller coaster.
Sure.
If the pandemic takes a turn, and what have you heard from students as far as wanting to get back to normal? Do you think that students have the stomach for more restrictions, or do you think that people are ready to get back to normal?
Yeah, I think probably our students, like much of the kind of greater population, are probably in different places. I think there are some that continue to be very concerned, and have shared that. I think there are others who would like to have kind of no protocols at all in place. And then there's probably that kind of great middle that kind of find themselves at some place along that spectrum. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge that as a community, people are in different places. And how do we kind of prudentially navigate that? And how are we thoughtful around that? I do very much appreciate, right, a deep desire to get back to normal. It's not just among our students. I think it's for all of us, right? To be able to focus on, I think, new initiatives, right? To be able to think a little bit about the future and not feel like we always have to be kind of speaking about the pandemic. But at the same time, I want to be able to acknowledge that we have to be thoughtful as a university. We have to be prudent. And I hope we're striking that right balance. I feel like we are. And I would say on the whole, that's the feedback I've received. But I want to acknowledge that there are students probably in both extremes that think we're doing too much and too little. So.
Well, your name is on the guidance emails. We get them from Student Affairs, and and much of I said earlier that much of your job has been about COVID, maybe whether you've liked it or not. But how much of do you think that any of your priorities or initiatives has been stifled by the pandemic? Things have been put on the back burner, and is there any was it intimidating to come in at this time in the university's history?
Sure, it was definitely a tough time to begin, right? So the entirety of my time, I began in student affairs in June of this past year, right, has been kind of dealing with the reality of COVID. And interestingly, right, as we began the fall semester, it was the Delta variant. And then as we began the spring semester, it was the Omicron. And so, I mean, even feeling like it, right as we're beginning to ramp up for a new semester, we've had to deal with two different variants, and some of the impact and realities. I know it's been upsetting that certain things, trips and travel, have had to be canceled, in particular, around the new year. And so I very much kind of recognize that that's difficult for our students. Again, you're trying to do what's best, and out of a real sense of care and concern for our students. But yeah, it does distract from doing some other things. And that's where, I'm hopeful as things really do improve in our country. And, we've had some really good kind of realities here on campus, that we can focus more on these new initiatives, right? And continuing to be able to address student needs, to continue to build a stronger community, to help people feel included, right? To help our students to be a force for good in the world. Like, that's what I want to do.
Right.
And I think that's what's important.
Right. Well, we still want to be the force for good in the world. That hasn't changed. But the world is different. The world is changing every day. Recently we've seen war in Europe. Recently we've seen, obviously we've been dealing with the pandemic. We've been dealing with things domestically. The world is different. Notre Dame is different. Notre Dame is changing. Is there any way that you're changing student affairs in this new time that you feel that really will help address whatever? Is there any way that student affairs is specifically changing to exist in the world that we live in today?
No, it's a great question. I hope maybe in sort of beginning by listening, right? As we started our conversation, I hope that's an important signal. I actually don't think as a country and a world, we listen to each other a lot. I think there's actually a lack of civility that we see, maybe exasperated by kind of social media and the way in which we interact there. And I think we can do something different here. And that's really interesting to me. I think about some of the realities of what's happening in Ukraine, right? I think about some of the realities of racial injustice in our country, the way in which we treat each other, political divisiveness. I wonder how Notre Dame might be able to kind of speak into those realities, be able to model something different, build a strong community, right? Where we can really find a true sense of connection, belonging, that even when we disagree, we can do so civilly, that we can engage with one another in different ways. And so I suppose as I think about kind of student affairs today, with all the realities that you outlined, I think that's a real opportunity for us. And that's something I'm really excited about thinking about.
Well, on this topic of, how we can listen to one another, we can be better to one another, I've heard that you were greatly influenced by a book by David Brooks, it's called The Second Mountain, and it's basically talking about, finding meaning in life and service to others. And, is with this, how is that influence your in this idea of finding meaning in life to others? I might need help on my God the Good Life paper from you, maybe. In creating a life like that, how has that influenced your form of leadership? You have direct reports, you oversee 250 staff. How has that influenced your leadership in this idea of service?
Yeah. So if you don't mind, I'll give a quick synopsis of the book. So David talks about all of us being on a journey up this first mountain of personal success, right? So whether it be graduating with Latin honors, my GPA, my postgraduate employment, the graduate school I get into. But he says, we either get to the top of that mountain or something happens along the way. Personal illness, the loss of a loved one. And we begin to ask the question, is this all there is to life? And he says it's then that we recognize that there's a second mountain. And rather than a life lived for ourselves, it's about a life lived for others. It's about being part of a community, a philosophy, a faith tradition that's larger than ourselves. And he says it's there that we find the deepest meaning in our life. And I think that's really important. I hope I'm successful in this role, and I will work my hardest to do so. But this role can't define me, right? My identity has to be something deeper than what I do. Right? It ultimately has to be my identity as a beloved child of God, right? My work as a Holy Cross priest. And I think that's in some ways allowed me to let go a little bit. I obviously work hard, I want to do well, but this job doesn't define me. And paradoxically, I think I do my job better because of that. So that's been a really important concept, I guess, for me personally, is to kind of think about what is my deepest meaning, what is my deepest identity, and grounding myself there. It's also been really powerful to recognize that I feel called to this work by God pretty clearly. And I believe that if God calls us to something, God also gives us the graces and the strength to do that which God calls us to. So that's been a source of some solace to me in my work. The other piece on the second mountain that's I find really interesting, Brooks talks about this distinction between happiness and joy. So he says happiness is sort of sensual pleasures, right? It's a great meal out with friends. It's my favorite team winning the Super Bowl or the college national championship. All good things. But there's a way in which these things are fleeting, right? Whatever kind of satisfaction we get from them kind of goes away after kind of a short period of time. And he contrasts kind of happiness with joy. And he says joy is what's abiding, right? It's what remains. It's kind of what kind of centers us and our lives. So I think it's an interesting thing for us to think about kind of that contrast between happiness and joy. And how do we seek out joy in our life?
Well, that's so interesting, and it's so apparent, that Notre Dame wants to make people that are whole and people that aren't just their major and things. Although I have to say that a Notre Dame national championship next year would give me enough joy. I don't know about you, but it would give me lots of joy. As we come to a close, I want to just get your take on, we've talked about the pandemic, we've talked about your role in student affairs, we talked about it all. And how would you describe a Notre Dame student today?
Yeah, I would say this is it almost feels like an incomplete description, but good. Someone who I think seeks out the good of another, seeks out the good in our world. I think who is kind of, as I mentioned, right, who feels themselves part of something larger than themselves, whether that be our own faith that we share, whether that be kind of part of a larger human family. I see that goodness in our students. I see a real dedication to community, to each other. I know we're imperfect at times, but overall, I see a sense of real support for each other. And I think that becomes grounding, right, as we try to discern how God's calling each one of us and how we're called to use our gifts in service to the world, that this place creates a kind of strong foundation from which we can go out and be able to use those gifts in our world.
Well, how wonderful. Thank you for that description.
Absolutely.
And thank you so much for being here today. That is it for us at ND Sunrise. We are so excited to have you. Thanks again so much for coming.
Thank you, Sam.
You are welcome back anytime, every year. Maybe we'll make it a tradition or something.
Sounds great. Thanks, Sam.
Thanks for being with us today, ND. We are excited for this next semester coming up after spring break. We are going to be back after spring break. We are going to be back, and so make sure to tune in at Notre Dame Television on YouTube. Make sure to follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much for being here. Go Irish. Beat midterms. Have a great spring break.